The Spartans and their cruel revenge, the terrible fate of enemy women. Amidst battles and bloody victories, Sparta left behind not only the glory of invincible warriors, but also one of the most terrible traditions of revenge. This is not for the faint of heart, for it was the Spartans who established a method of punishing their enemies that was unparalleled anywhere in the world. And no man could have imagined the price of defeat for those who fell into captivity. The silence that fills the entire valley is suddenly broken by a scream. It is not just a scream. It is the scream of a woman who is losing everything. Her hands can no longer hold on to the tree to which she is tied. Her eyes are filled with indescribable fear because she knows that even more pain lies ahead. Is a man capable of surviving what will be done to her? The Spartans had a cruel rule. If an enemy did not surrender, his wife was taken away. But this was no ordinary captive. It was a ritual that involved the most brutal methods of psychological and physical pressure to completely break the will of even the strongest. It was important not only to win, but also to humiliate to the utmost. The wives of enemies who were taken prisoner had no choice. They became part of what the Spartans called punishment. The choice was simple: be a widow or endure the terrible. Those who were not killed immediately were subjected to torture that resembled not so much punishment as the complete destruction of the personality. Why were women the main victims of this abuse? This question still leaves many questions for researchers of this era. For the Spartans, victory was not only a matter of honor on the battlefield. It was part of a strategic plan where every action had its own profound meaning. The destruction of the enemy's spirit began, first and foremost, with breaking their women. The Spartans believed that this would destroy the family, and, with it, any hope of restoring strength. If the enemy lost everything they loved, they would no longer be able to resist. This tradition was adhered to not only in battles, but also in military campaigns. Every Spartan warrior knew that the main goal was not simply to kill the enemy. The Spartans sought to completely destroy his legacy, starting with what they did to his women. This ritual was more than just revenge. It was a means of achieving complete psychological superiority over the enemy. In every battle, after defeating their enemies, the Spartans took the women of their captives and sent them to their settlement. It was a terrible and bitter ordeal for every woman. They became mere shadows of their former lives, deprived not only of their freedom, but also of their human dignity. There were cases when the Spartans used these women as living trophies, displaying them as a symbol of power and might. They were forced to live in terrible conditions, performing forced labor, and sometimes even became part of the Spartans' sadistic entertainment. Perhaps these cruel traditions were not just a manifestation of savagery, but a strategic move that made Sparta's enemies fear not only death, but their very existence. For the Spartans, victory was only the beginning of a process of psychological destruction. Each such story, each such case, became part of a legend that lived on in wars and traditions. And even centuries later, we still remember these dark pages of history, where each battle not only left traces of blood on the battlefield, but also destroyed entire families. Thus, the Spartans, embodying their own ideas of greatness and power, showed the world that sometimes victory is not just a physical act, but a profound moral and psychological victory that can only be achieved by defeating the enemy not only on the battlefield, but also in his soul. These Spartan methods had no analogues in most civilized states of that time. The cruelty and cold-bloodedness of their actions came as a shock even to the most daring enemies. What the Spartans did to their prisoners was impressive, not only for its cruelty, but also for its strategic calculation. There was not only physical force, but also psychological tactics aimed at demoralizing the enemy. Taking their women and children away meant not only depriving them of the joy of life, but also depriving them of the deepest emotional ties that could inspire them to seek revenge or fight. The Spartans believed that this was the only way to defeat their enemies morally, by taking away what they valued most. Such a strategy may have seemed cruel, but on the battlefield it gave them an unbeatable advantage, as their enemies became lost, demoralized, and ready to surrender or die. In this context, the Spartans appeared not only as ruthless warriors, but as true masters of psychological warfare. They understood that if the enemy was unable to protect what was most precious to them, they would become vulnerable on all other levels. The loss of what was most important was the beginning of the path to complete victory. This tactic allowed them to become true masters of manipulation. By depriving the enemy of his family and dignity, they took away his most valuable asset, his motivation to fight. The Spartans clearly understood that in battle, it is not only physical strength that matters, but also an inner readiness to make cruel decisions. If women fell into the hands of the Spartans alive, their lives became part of a new, cruel reality. Their existence no longer had anything in common with the life they had before the battle. They became part of a cruel mechanism in which there was no place for compassion or a sense of security. The Spartans adhered to a clear strategy in which every part of the victory was important. Each stage, each act of destruction became part of a grand plan. It was not just a physical war, but a real battle for hearts and minds. All these terrible actions had one goal: final, uncompromising victory. And even when it seemed that everything had already been decided, the Spartans did not stop there. With each new step, with each new sacrifice, their strategy became more ruthless, more effective. They left their enemies no chance. The Spartans had a clear understanding that war was not just about combat. They used every means possible to leave their opponents with no hope of victory. By taking away their enemies' loved ones, the Spartans convinced them that their struggle was futile. The battles in which this tactic was used had nothing in common with those that usually took place on the battlefield. Here, every act of violence, every step of the war, was aimed not simply at killing, but at the moral and emotional destruction of the enemy. When the enemy loses everything that is important to them, they cannot resist effectively. The Spartans knew this and used it to their advantage. But this was not just cruelty. It was a tactic proven over centuries. The Spartans treated their prisoners and the women of their enemies as important elements of war. They knew that even one broken link between a person and his family could be enough to break his spirit. And this chain of lost connections became one of the main mechanisms of victory. In these moments, the Spartans truly seemed invincible. They not only possessed strength, but also used their intellect and strategic thinking to defeat the enemy not only on the battlefield, but also in their own hearts. The cruelty of war in their hands became an instrument of victory. However, this does not mean that the Spartans did not know how to act in their own interests. They closely monitored their position and chose moments when their sacrifices would bring the greatest benefit. These cruel actions were not thoughtless. Every step, every strategy was planned down to the smallest detail. Even in conditions of absolute cruelty, they left room for thoughtful strategy. But the worst thing the Spartans did to their enemies was to make them feel helpless. The impossibility of turning back and the lack of hope for salvation became so palpable that even the most steadfast spirits could not endure it. The enemy began to feel that their existence was meaningless, and this became a final sentence. According to some sources, when the Spartans took the women of their enemies captive, it was often not limited to mere violence. Most women became part of the Spartan strategy. They were used not only to create families, but also to break the spirit of the remnants of enemies who had not been physically destroyed. The Spartans knew that emotional and psychological violence could be much more effective than any other form of combat. An enemy who lost his family, his honor, his land, lost not only material goods, but also his human dignity. The Spartans used this factor to achieve their goals even when immediate military victory would have been difficult or impossible. And this method of intimidation was not accidental. The Spartans used it to ensure the security of their nation, even if it meant creating a psychological trap for those who tried to oppose them. They knew that this had a long-term effect on their enemies. Psychological pressure became one of the main elements of Spartan strategy, allowing them not only to win battles, but also to control the situation within the enemy. Over time, this cruelty became part of their culture, their upbringing, and their ideology. Not only did the Spartans show no mercy to their enemies, but they also believed that this was how they could guarantee a secure future for themselves. It was their way of surviving in the harsh and cruel world of ancient Greece, where only the strongest could exist. And even when it seemed that all means had been exhausted, the Spartans did not stop. They understood that war was not just a battle on the battlefield. It was a psychological struggle, a struggle for spirit, to make the enemy feel weak, even in their strongest moments. And the most frightening thing is that the Spartans successfully applied this strategy not only in battle, but in every aspect of their lives. For them, it was a way of life, constantly instilling fear and control. Over the centuries, the Spartans developed strategies that sought not only to destroy the enemy physically, but also morally. They knew that when fighting for their interests, they had to break the enemy's spirit so that they could not even think about recovery. Enemy women captured during battle became part of their grand strategy. This could not be simply ignored. They became part of the psychological threat that was felt both inside and outside the walls of Sparta. But there was also something that the Spartans could not control. Even the best strategy did not always lead to victory. Therefore, they were ready to adapt to new conditions and change tactics. This was their strength, the ability to change direction at the right time without losing sight of their core principles. In every situation, the Spartans showed extraordinary flexibility, which allowed them to achieve victory even in the most difficult conditions. In addition, the Spartans always had another goal in mind. They sought to ensure their own survival and prosperity. Their culture and ideology required them to always be ready to fight, to defend their home and their family. And even if this meant using methods that at first glance seemed cruel or unacceptable, the Spartans did not hesitate to do so. However, this cruelty had its limits. There were moments in the history of the Spartans when their strength and determination became their greatest weakness. Sometimes the pursuit of absolute power led to a loss of internal control and a split in society. But even in such times, the Spartans did not abandon their principles. They continued to fight for their place under the sun, even if it meant resorting to cruel and difficult actions. And so, when we assess their legacy, we must remember that their strength lay not only in battle, but also in the cruel and cold-blooded strategy that made them indestructible. An enemy who fell into their hands knew that they would not easily escape this trap. Even centuries later, these lessons remain relevant, reminding us why the Spartans became legendary. But what happened to the women captured by the Spartans? As a rule, they did not simply become trophies of war, but part of a mechanism designed to destroy the enemy's morale. The relationship between the captured women and the Spartans was often psychological in nature. They became instruments reflecting the cruelty of war. The Spartans understood that the greatest blow to the enemy was not only physical destruction, but also psychological. And the women in the hands of the victors became one such means. Captured women undoubtedly became victims, not only because of physical violence, but also because of social isolation and psychological suffering. In some cases, they were used as propaganda. Their fate was supposed to make the enemy understand that no effort could ensure victory. It was a strategy of intimidation aimed at demoralizing and breaking the spirit not only of the military, but also of the population as a whole. For the Spartans, the main thing was not only to destroy the enemy physically, but also to ensure that they would never dream of revenge again. It can even be said that the Spartans possessed extraordinary skill in creating strategies that included the psychological destruction of their opponents. After all, for them, war did not end on the battlefield. They understood perfectly well that sometimes the greatest victories are achieved without a single shot being fired, with the help of sophisticated strategic moves. Their methods included everything from combat tactics to psychological warfare, to the point of making the enemy feel defeated even before the battle began. It cannot be said that the Spartans had no morals or ethics, but their morals were far from modern ideas of good and evil. They chose their strategies according to what was necessary to ensure their survival and victory. And this approach achieved its goal. The Spartans were one of the most powerful and famous civilizations in the world, and even after their fall, their methods and ideas continued to inspire subsequent generations of warriors. However, we cannot ignore the fact that these cruel methods had a downside. Sometimes war took not only the bodies of enemies, but also the souls of their own warriors. And although the Spartans won many victories, they also paid a high price. They lost their best warriors in battle and lost their identity due to the constant pressure created by their lifestyle. Even in their glory, the Spartans could not escape the consequences of their path, a path that required constant struggle not only with enemies, but also with their own inner demons. One way or another, even in the heart of Sparta, the spirit of constant struggle was felt. This spirit compelled them to adhere to their traditions and methods, even when new threats arose before them. And although they did not always win battles, their determination and indomitability left them a legend that many generations after their demise looked up to. In the end, even though the Spartans often used cruel methods to achieve their goals, their ability to adapt and overcome difficulties remained their strongest asset. They demonstrated that war is not only a struggle for territory, but also a struggle for consciousness, for dominance at the level of ideas. Even centuries later, their methods and principles continue to be important lessons for modern strategists, military leaders, and leaders. But, as history shows, even the strongest systems eventually reach their limits. Sparta, despite its former power, began to decline. There were many reasons for this, but one of the main ones was that the Spartans were unable to adapt to new conditions. They had remained at the top for so long, thanks to their cruelty and uncompromising nature, that when circumstances changed and new strategies and tactics emerged, Sparta was no longer able to respond to new challenges. This is another important part of history that cannot be ignored. The Spartans had a powerful military apparatus, but when the situation changed, when new, unexpected threats appeared on the horizon, they were unable to adapt quickly. Other states, which at first seemed weaker, now had the opportunity to change the course of the war thanks to new methods of warfare, new strategies, and even changes in the political landscape. This was a real trap for Sparta. They were always ready for war, but not ready for change. They couldn't afford to stop fighting, even when their enemies became less obvious. As is often the case in the history of great civilizations, the tremendous power that once brought them glory became a hindrance when the time for change came. The Spartans were stuck in their own traditions, unable to rethink their approaches. And then, in an instant, their kingdom began to crumble. First, due to internal problems such as economic instability, resource shortages, and general fatigue from constant conflict. Then, due to external problems, when new states with new methods of warfare began to capture territories that had previously seemed unattainable to the enemy. The decline of Sparta became inevitable, and even their strength, which had been the key to their greatness, could not save it. Although the Spartans continued to fight, it was too late to change their fate. Sparta disappeared from the historical arena, but left important lessons for future generations. Their determination, dedication, and strategic approaches were impressive, but it was their inability to adapt that became their greatest vulnerability. They taught the world how important it is to be prepared for change, how important it is to respond to new challenges in a timely manner, and how cruelty can be both an advantage and a trap. The story of the Spartans shows that even the most powerful nations cannot escape the law of change, and that even the most ruthless methods of warfare, however effective they may seem, can become obsolete over time. And although Sparta was a great example of military prowess and strategy, its decline also became an important lesson for all future civilizations. But could it have been avoided? This question is often asked by historians. Could Sparta have changed course, or was it doomed from the start? This is not just a question about the past. It is a question that concerns every nation and every state at any point in history. How can one remain strong without losing flexibility and adaptability? And most importantly, how can one ensure that strength does not become a trap? Несподівано відгомін війни став ще більш загрозливим. Спартанці, маючи свій унікальний погляд на честь і славу, почали справжній крок у невідомість. Але з кожним днем у їхніх діях з'являлося все більше чуток. Одні говорили про нові обряди, інші – про неймовірну жорстокість, яку ніхто не міг собі уявити. І хоча до цього часу Спарта славилася своїми військовими подвигами, поступово відносини з іншими державами ставали настільки напруженими, що Спарта почала переслідувати кожен прояв слабкості. І ось перед ними постало нове завдання – нав'язати свій порядок не тільки на полі бою, але і в приватних справах. Що відбувалося після смерті ворога? Вже не було сумнівів, що спартанці готові вийти за межі людських уявлень. З кожною новою атакою спартанці почали залишати за собою не тільки поле битви, але й ще страшніші знаки перемоги. Вони почали застосовувати методи, які вже через кілька поколінь стали запозиченням іншими культурами, хоча і значно спотвореними. На перший погляд, це могло здатися абсурдом. Жінки ворогів, здавалося б, повинні були залишатися поза політикою, принаймні в класичному розумінні. Але в Спарті жінка мала свої ролі. Не менш важливу роль вона відігравала і в обрядових традиціях спартанців. Спочатку здавалося, що все це тільки слова. Але коли настав момент дії, все стало на свої місця. Спартанці завжди вважали, що жінка, як символ вірності і сили, повинна бути переможена заради власної культури. Спартанки, хоча й мали права, які в інших культурах були недоступні жінкам, все ж повинні були підкорятися законам, встановленим чоловіками. І ось, коли чоловіки гинули, наступним кроком був ритуал, де саме жінки ставали частиною цієї страшної церемонії. Історії часто розповідають про те, як спартанці ставили жінок у неймовірно скрутне становище. Ті жінки, які залишалися живими після поразки їхніх чоловіків, не могли й подумати, що станеться далі. Їхня доля ставала частиною ритуалу, що в кінцевому підсумку призводило до перетворення їх на символи або, точніше, жертви на благо тієї спартанської культури. Кілька поколінь спартанців чітко дотримувалися заповітів своїх предків. Однак найстрашніший момент був ще попереду. Мова йшла не тільки про саму смерть ворога, але і про його рідних. І ось цього разу жертви змінювалися. Те, що спартанці робили з тілами своїх ворогів, вже було не просто насильством. Це стало частиною стратегічного задуму, який став частиною державного апарату Спарти. Маленькі, але надзвичайно важливі деталі обрядів змінювали вигляд не тільки на полі бою, але й за його межами. Це була кульмінаційна пастка, коли кожен вибір став остаточним, і можливості повернутися вже не було. З кожним новим вчинком спартанці не тільки зміцнювали свою славу, але й створювали атмосферу, яка і далі поглиблювала їх образ у світі. Війна з кожним кроком ставала не тільки фізичною боротьбою, але й боротьбою за збереження і зміцнення своїх традицій, які не визнавали інші культури. Спартанці не були схожі на інших воїнів. Вони дотримувалися своїх правил, навіть коли це означало втрату людяності, в буквальному сенсі цього слова. Що ж, ми підійшли до фінальної точки. Ця частина історії Спарти, безсумнівно, залишить враження на слухача. Все те, що сталося з жінками ворогів, вражає своєю жорстокістю і непередбачуваністю. Однак саме так і створювався міф про спартанців – суворих, безжальних, але в той же час надзвичайно дисциплінованих. І хоча їхні методи завжди були на межі людських уявлень про мораль, Спарта досі залишається яскравим прикладом історії, де військова сила і суворі закони переплітаються в одну величну і страшну картину.